They said I wasn't strategic enough to lead right after I single-handedly brought in $480 million. So I smiled, walked out the door, and took their biggest clients with me. Call it petty. I call it precision. My name is Lauren Prescott. At 38, I've spent the last 15 years of my life dedicated to renewable energy consulting. Now I run my own firm, Prescott Advisory Partners, where I've signed contracts with 4 of the industry's leading energy corporations, all former clients of my previous employer, Nexora Solutions. How did I get here? It's quite simple. They demoted me after I closed a $480 million deal. So I took the clients with me. The irony isn't lost on me. For years, I had been the strategic development specialist who consistently exceeded targets at Nexora. I built relationships with clients that went beyond the typical consultant-client dynamic. I knew their children's names, their anniversary dates, their favorite wines, and most importantly, I knew exactly what kept them up at night regarding their energy transitions. This wasn't just relationship management, it was genuine connection, something increasingly rare in our industry. The day everything changed was deceptively ordinary. It was a Friday afternoon in late September, the kind where summer reluctantly gives way to autumn. I had just returned from Singapore, where I'd finalized the details of what would become Nexora's largest contract to date, a $480 million deal with the International Green Infrastructure Alliance, a consortium of governments and private companies committed to developing sustainable energy infrastructure across Southeast Asia. My phone buzzed with a calendar invite, Strategic Leadership Update Boardroom 4:30 p.m. The meeting wasn't scheduled until next week, and sudden calendar changes at Nexora usually meant one thing: someone was getting promoted or fired. Given that I'd just secured the biggest deal in company history, I assumed it might be good news, perhaps the VP position I'd been eyeing for the past 2 years. I couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived at the boardroom 5 minutes early. As was my habit, the glass-walled space offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a vista I'd always appreciated during difficult negotiations. Today, however, the room felt different. Cameron Voss, our recently appointed CEO, sat at the head of the table, flanked by Heather from HR and Jeffrey Daniels, the Chief Operations Officer. What struck me immediately was the presence of Natalie Quinn, a 29-year-old MBA Nexora had poached from McKinsey just 3 months prior. "Lauren, thank you for joining us on short notice," Cameron began, his practiced smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We wanted to discuss some organizational changes that will be announced company-wide on Monday." I nodded, maintaining my professional composure while a slight uneasiness began to settle in my stomach. As you know, Nexora is at a critical juncture. The Singapore deal you've helped secure puts us in a position to scale globally in ways we've only dreamed of before. I noticed his careful phrasing, helped secure, not secured or led. It was a subtle but telling diminishment of my role. To capitalize on this momentum, we're restructuring the leadership team to ensure we have the strategic vision necessary for our next chapter. The next words came like a perfectly aimed arrow. "We've decided to shift your role to a senior advisory position, where your tactical expertise will continue to be valuable. Meanwhile, Natalie will be stepping into the role of Global Strategy Director, overseeing all major client relationships, including the Singapore Consortium." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I had just closed a $500 million deal, the culmination of 18 months of painstaking work, countless red-eye flights, and negotiations so delicate they had required diplomatic finesse worthy of the State Department, and now I was being demoted. "I'm sorry. I'm not sure I understand," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline now flooding my system. "You're removing me from client-facing leadership right after I've secured the largest contract in Nexora's history." Cameron leaned forward, his expression a practiced blend of empathy and firmness. "Lauren, your contribution to the Singapore deal has been tremendous, and no one is denying that. You excel at execution and relationship management, but Nexora's next phase requires a different kind of leadership, someone with a more comprehensive strategic vision for global markets." Natalie shifted in her seat, her expression carefully neutral. though I caught the slightest hint of a satisfied smile at the corner of her mouth. Natalie brings fresh perspective from her experience at McKinsey. Cameron continued. Her global outlook and innovative approach to market penetration is exactly what we need right now. Your role as senior advisor will allow you to support these initiatives while focusing on what you do best. What I do best apparently wasn't leading a team, developing strategy, or bringing in nearly $500 million in new business. The implication was clear. I was a glorified account manager, not a strategist, not leadership material. I see, I said, the words tasting bitter. And this decision is final. The announcement goes out Monday, Cameron replied, confirming without directly answering. We've prepared a communication plan to ensure a smooth transition with clients. Natalie will be reaching out to the Singapore team first thing next week. Heather from HR slid a folder across the table. This outlines the details of your new position, including compensation adjustments. I didn't open it. I didn't need to see that this senior advisory role almost certainly came with a significant pay cut to match my diminished responsibilities. I'd like some time to process this, I said, rising from my chair. Would it be all right if I reviewed this over the weekend and came back with any questions on Monday? Cameron seemed relieved by my measured response. Of course, take the weekend. We value you tremendously, Lauren, and want to make this transition work for everyone. I nodded, gathered my things, and walked out with my dignity intact. No one in that room could have guessed that behind my composed exterior, gears were already turning. The weekend wasn't spent grieving my demotion. It was spent investigating. First, I contacted Maya Chen, my executive assistant who had become more of a trusted confidant over the years. I've been expecting your call, she said when she picked up. The rumors have been circulating all week. What rumors? That they were bringing Natalie in above you. Some people in the office pool had bets on whether you'd quit on the spot. This had been planned well before Friday's ambush meeting. Do you know how long this has been in the works? There was a pause. Lauren, check your company email. Search for any meeting invites with your clients that you weren't included on. Following Maya's hint, I found what I was looking for. Over the past 3 months, Natalie had been quietly shadowing all my client meetings, introduced as a strategic observer or cross-functional team member. She'd been taking meticulous notes on my client relationships, approaches, and strategies. In several cases, she'd scheduled follow-up meetings without my knowledge. But the real revelation came when I accessed the company's shared drive. There, in a folder marked Leadership Transition, was a PowerPoint presentation dated 2 months earlier while I was still in the middle of negotiating the Singapore deal. The deck outlined the succession plan for transitioning my clients to Natalie's leadership, with a timeline that perfectly aligned with the closing of the Singapore contract. They had been planning to replace me all along, waiting only for me to close the massive deal before pushing me aside. The final piece of evidence came from an unlikely source. Jeffrey Daniels, the COO, who had been in my demotion meeting, sent me a cryptic text, Saturday night, check your personal email. There, I found a forwarded email chain between Cameron and the board, discussing how my relationship-focused approach lacks the strategic depth necessary for Nexora's global expansion. Despite acknowledging that my tactical execution remains unparalleled and should be leveraged to secure the Singapore deal before implementing leadership changes. They had knowingly exploited my skills and relationships to secure the contract, all while planning to hand the fruits of my labor to someone else. The betrayal was calculated, cold, and complete. By Sunday evening, my shock had transformed into clarity. I knew exactly what I needed to do. Monday morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. Before anyone else was in, I cleared my personal items from my desk and downloaded all my performance reviews and contribution records from the HR portal documentation of my consistent excellence that would prove useful later. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, I walked into Cameron's office without knocking. I've made my decision, I said, placing the unopened folder from Friday on his desk along with a single sheet of paper. That's my resignation, effective immediately. His face registered genuine surprise. They had expected me to accept the demotion, to be grateful for even being kept around. Lauren, I think you're being hasty. The advisory role offers significant. The advisory role is a consolation prize designed to sideline me while Natalie takes credit for relationships and strategies I've built over years. I interrupted. We both know that. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. This isn't personal, Lauren, it's just business. I agree completely. I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Which is why I'll be taking my 2 weeks of accrued vacation effective today, rather than serving a notice period. My decision is as strategic as it is final. Before leaving his office, I turned back. One more thing, I've prepared personalized emails to each of my clients, informing them of my departure. As a professional courtesy, I wanted to let you know they'll be receiving those within the hour. The blood drained from Cameron's face. You can't contact clients directly about this. The transition communication plan. Actually, I can. There's nothing in my contract preventing me from informing professional contacts of my career changes. I've been careful not to disparage Nexora in any way. I'm simply letting them know I'm moving on to new opportunities. I thought you'd appreciate the transparency. I walked out of his office feeling lighter than I had in years. The emails to clients were masterpieces of professional restraint. I thanked each one for the privilege of working with them, briefly mentioned I was leaving Nexora to pursue new opportunities, and wished them continued success. What I didn't mention but knew would be abundantly clear to anyone who had worked with me was that my departure coincided suspiciously with the successful completion of the Singapore deal. Within hours, my phone was flooded with messages from confused and concerned clients. I responded to each one personally, never bad-mouthing Nexora, never revealing the humiliating demotion, simply stating that it was time for a new chapter. When pressed, I would only add that Nexora is moving in a different strategic direction that better aligns with their global vision, echoing the very corporate speak that had been used to justify my removal. The most significant call came from Aditya Patel, the lead negotiator for the Singapore consortium. Lauren, what is going on? I just received a formal introduction email from someone named Natalie Quinn, claiming she'll be our new primary contact at Nexora. Nexora is restructuring their leadership team. I explained neutrally. Natalie is extremely capable. I'm sure the transition will be seamless. There was a long pause. Lauren, we signed this deal because of you. Because you understood our concerns about environmental impact beyond just the financial returns. Because you spent 6 months designing an implementation framework that addressed the cultural and political complexities of operating across 5 different countries. This Natalie person, do you honestly believe she can deliver what you promised? I chose my words carefully. Nexora has made their strategic decision. I respect your right to make yours. Another pause. Are you bound by a non-compete? No, I replied truthfully. Nexora had never bothered with non-competes for anyone below the C-suite, confident in their market position and perhaps arrogant about employee loyalty. But I haven't decided my next steps yet. When you do, Aditya said, please call me first. Similar conversations played out with other clients over the next few days. I never solicited their business. I never disparaged Nexora. I simply existed as a living reminder of what they were losing: the personal touch, the deep understanding, the trust built over years of attentive service. Meanwhile, at Nexora, panic was setting in. Maya, who still worked there, kept me updated. Natalie was struggling to connect with the clients, particularly the Singapore consortium. Her polished McKinsey approach, while impressive in boardrooms, lacked the personal touch and nuanced understanding of cultural dynamics that had made me successful. Cameron was reportedly spending hours on damage control calls. By the end of my first week away from Nexora, I had registered a new company, Prescott Advisory Partners, specializing in sustainable energy consulting with an emphasis on transparent implementation strategies. I leased a small office space and created a minimalist website that highlighted my experience and philosophy without ever mentioning Nexora by name. I didn't need to recruit clients. They came to me. The first was Harold Jensen from Nordic Renewables, a mid-sized but influential player in European wind farm development. That Quinn woman spent our entire call talking about synergistic approaches and market penetration strategies without once mentioning the regulatory hurdles we discussed with you last quarter. He complained, "We need someone who understands the practical realities, not just the theory." Within 2 weeks, I had signed consulting agreements with 3 former Nexora clients, including Nordic Renewables. I was careful to structure these agreements around new projects or expanded work, nothing that would directly violate their existing contracts with Nexora. The Singapore consortium was more complicated. They were legally bound to Nexora through the $480 million contract I had negotiated. However, they added a clause to their agreement requiring an implementation consultant of their choosing, which turned out to be Prescott Advisory Partners. This arrangement meant I would still oversee the actual execution of the project, while Nexora maintained the primary contract. It was an elegant solution that respected legal boundaries while effectively sidelining Natalie. Cameron called me himself when he found out. "This is a deliberate attempt to undermine our client relationships," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You're poaching our clients." "I haven't poached anyone," I replied calmly. "I simply made myself available as an independent consultant. The clients made their own decisions based on who they trust to deliver results." "We could sue you for this." "On what grounds I've violated no non-compete, disclosed no confidential information, and solicited no one? I've simply accepted offers from companies who approached me independently." There was a long silence. We both knew he had no legal recourse. "You know, we were willing to keep you on in a good role," he finally said. "This vindictive response only confirms we made the right decision about your leadership capabilities." I couldn't help but laugh. "Cameron, let me be clear, I didn't leave Nexora because you hurt my feelings. I left because you demonstrated poor business judgment. You sacrificed genuine client relationships for PowerPoint strategies. You prioritize pedigree over proven results. That's your prerogative as CEO. But it doesn't obligate me to go down with a ship you're deliberately steering into the rocks." I hung up before he could respond. Over the next 2 months, the consequences of Nexora's decision rippled through the company. The Singapore consortium formally requested that all communications go through me as their implementation consultant, effectively cutting Natalie out of meaningful involvement with their project. 2 other major clients put their contracts under review, citing concerns about continuity and execution. An industry publication ran a story titled, "Client Exodus at Nexora Raises Questions About Leadership Changes," which detailed how the company had lost nearly 30% of its top-tier client relationships in less than a quarter. The article didn't mention me by name, but quoted an anonymous source close to the matter who noted that the departure of key relationship managers coincided with significant client dissatisfaction. Natalie Quinn resigned 3 months after her promotion, citing strategic differences with the executive team. 2 weeks later, the board asked Cameron to step down. Neither of them contacted me, but I heard through industry channels that my name had become something of a cautionary tale in Nexora's hallways, an example of how not to handle valuable talent. Meanwhile, Prescott Advisory Partners flourished. I hired selectively, focusing on talented consultants who had been overlooked at larger firms, often women over 40, like me, whose tactical expertise and relationship skills had been dismissed as insufficiently strategic. We developed a reputation for delivering practical, implementable solutions rather than glossy presentations full of business jargon. By the end of our first year, we had grown to a team of 12 consultants managing a portfolio worth over $600 million in client projects. The Singapore implementation was proceeding ahead of schedule and under budget, earning us referrals throughout the Asia-Pacific region. I received numerous requests for interviews about my journey from demotion to disruption. As one business magazine framed it, I declined them all. My success wasn't a story for public consumption, it was simply the natural consequence of valuing substance over style, relationships over rhetoric. I did, however, accept an invitation to speak at a TEDx event focused on ethical business leadership. I didn't discuss Nexora or my demotion. Instead, I spoke about trust as the ultimate currency in professional relationships. When someone trusts you with their business, they're trusting you with their livelihood, their reputation, their future. I told the audience, that trust isn't transferable. It can't be acquired in a merger or handed off in a reorganization. It must be earned and maintained through consistent integrity and delivery. At the reception afterward, a young consultant approached me. Is it true what they say that you were demoted after closing a massive deal, so you took the clients with you? I smiled. What I did was honor the trust those clients had placed in me. They didn't follow me out of loyalty to me personally, but out of commitment to the approach and values I represent. If you build genuine trust, you carry that responsibility wherever you go. Some people call it revenge, she persisted. I call it responsibility, I replied. In business, as in life, we vote with our presence. We endorse with our participation. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply to take your value elsewhere and let the results speak for themselves. As I look back now, 5 years after that Friday afternoon ambush meeting, I feel no resentment toward Cameron, Natalie, or Nexora. They made a business decision based on what they valued. Their mistake wasn't in undervaluing me, it was in undervaluing the depth of the client relationships I had built and maintained. They assumed clients were buying the Nexora brand rather than the trust and expertise I represented. Nexora still exists, though in a diminished capacity after a private equity firm acquired and restructured it. Cameron now teaches business strategy at a mid-tier MBA program. Natalie went on to leadership roles at other consulting firms. I wish them well. As for me, Prescott Advisory Partners now employs over 50 consultants across 3 continents. We recently declined an acquisition offer that valued the company at $175 million, more than a third of the Singapore deal that once defined my value at Nexora. We're selective about our clients and our projects, focusing exclusively on renewable energy initiatives that balance profitability with genuine environmental and social impact. The lesson in all of this isn't about revenge, it's about recognition. Recognizing your own value when others fail to. And recognizing that true business relationships are built on trust that can't be delegated, transferred, or restructured away. The clients who followed me didn't do so out of loyalty to me personally, but because I represented an approach to business that valued their needs above internal politics or theoretical strategies. They demoted me after I closed a $480 million deal, so I took the clients with me, not out of petty revenge, but out of profound responsibility to the trust those clients had placed in me. In the end, that made all the difference. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. It gives you the freedom to rewrite the rules while everyone else is busy playing the game. 5 years later, I'm still rewriting those rules, one client relationship at a time. And I wouldn't have it any other way. The morning after my TEDx talk went live online, I received an email from Jeffrey Daniels, the former COO of Nexora, who had secretly forwarded me the damning emails during that fateful weekend. Saw your talk. He wrote, didn't mention Nexora once, yet somehow told the whole story. Masterful. For what it's worth, I argued against your demotion. Cameron was convinced Natalie's McKinsey pedigree was the magic bullet we needed. Classic case of valuing credentials over competence. My question, how did you know the clients would follow you? I thought carefully before responding. The truth was, I hadn't known for certain. I had hoped, believed, but not known. Taking that leap had required faith in the relationships I'd built and the value I'd consistently delivered. I didn't know they would follow, I replied honestly. I just knew I couldn't stay. The clients made their own decisions based on who they trusted to deliver what they needed. His response came quickly. Therein lies the difference between your approach and Cameron's. He thought client relationships belonged to Nexora. You understood they belonged to no one, they're earned daily through trust and delivery. Jeffrey's insight crystallized something I'd felt but never fully articulated. In today's business world, we talk endlessly about owning relationships, capturing market share, and locking in clients, as if loyalty can be secured through contracts and brands alone. The reality is far more dynamic and human. Professional relationships, like personal ones, thrive on trust, respect, and consistent value exchange. When those elements disappear, no contract or brand loyalty can preserve the connection. This philosophy became the cornerstone of Prescott Advisory Partners as we continued to grow. Rather than focusing on aggressive expansion or maximizing billable hours, we built our reputation on transformative client outcomes and transparent practices. We turned down lucrative projects when we didn't believe we could deliver exceptional value. We recommended competitors when they were better positioned to meet a client's specific needs. We shared our methodologies openly, believing that our value lay not in proprietary frameworks, but in our execution and customization. This approach attracted a certain type of client, those who valued substance over spectacle, results over rhetoric. It also attracted a certain type of consultant professionals, who had often been overlooked at larger firms because they prioritized client outcomes over internal politics. Maya Chen eventually joined us as chief of staff, bringing her organizational brilliance and institutional knowledge. Nexora has become a case study in how not to manage talent, she told me over coffee on her first day. The brain drain after you left was staggering. Anyone who could find an exit took it. I never intended to start an exodus, I admitted. You didn't have to, she replied. You just showed that there were alternatives to accepting mistreatment. Sometimes people just need to see that the door exists before they can walk through it. Her words stayed with me as our firm continued to evolve. I began mentoring younger consultants, particularly women who reminded me of myself a decade earlier, sharp, driven, relationship-focused professionals who were often told they weren't strategic enough, despite consistently delivering results. I shared my story not as a blueprint for revenge, but as permission to recognize and stand in their own value. The greatest career mistake you can make, I would tell them, is accepting someone else's flawed valuation of your worth. Data matters, results matter. If someone tells you you're not strategic enough despite evidence to the contrary, that's not a performance issue, it's a perception issue, and often one clouded by bias. 3 years after founding Prescott Advisory Partners, I received an unexpected meeting request from Aditya Patel, who had since become the CEO of the Singapore Consortium, now renamed Asia-Pacific Sustainable Infrastructure Group, APASIG. We're planning a major expansion, he explained when we met at his downtown office. Triple the original investment, 15 countries instead of 5. We want Prescott as our primary strategic partner. The proposal he outlined would transform our company overnight, potentially tripling our revenue and requiring significant expansion of our team. It was the type of opportunity most consulting firms dream of, a chance to leapfrog years of gradual growth in a single bound. This is incredibly flattering, I said after he finished his presentation, but I have concerns about scaling that quickly while maintaining our quality and culture. Aditya smiled. That's exactly why we want you, Lauren. Anyone else would have said yes immediately and figured out the details later. You're still thinking about whether you can actually deliver what you promise. It's a significant responsibility, I acknowledged. It is, he agreed. But remember when we first met, and I expressed concerns about whether renewable infrastructure could be implemented without displacing local communities. Everyone else dismissed those concerns as secondary to the financial structure. You stayed up all night creating an alternative implementation timeline that preserved those communities and actually improved the long-term returns. I remembered that night well, the hotel room in Singapore, surrounded by spreadsheets and local policy documents, determined to find a solution that served all stakeholders. That's the approach we need for this expansion, Aditya continued. Not just technical expertise, but the commitment to finding solutions that work on multiple levels. We've worked with 5 other consulting firms since the original project launched. None of them approach problems the way you and your team do. In that moment, I realized how far I'd come from that Friday afternoon ambush at Nexora. What Cameron had dismissed as a lack of strategic thinking was actually a different kind of strategy altogether, one focused on sustainable value creation rather than quick wins and flashy presentations. We'll need 6 months to scale up responsibly, I told Aditya. And I want to structure this as a partnership with knowledge transfer built in. so your team develops the internal capacity to manage these processes independently over time. He looked surprised. Most consultants try to create perpetual dependency. We're not most consultants, I replied with a smile. Our success isn't measured by how long you need us, but by how effectively we enable you to achieve your goals. We signed the partnership agreement a month later. True to my word, I insisted on a structure that included training and capacity building for AppSig's internal team. This approach initially reduced our potential revenue, but ultimately created a deeper, more collaborative relationship that extended beyond the original scope. The AppSig expansion became a signature achievement for Prescott Advisory Partners, not just for its size, but for its approach. We assembled diverse implementation teams that included local experts and community representatives alongside technical specialists. We developed transparency protocols that set new standards for the industry. Most importantly, we delivered on time, under budget, and with measurable positive impacts beyond the financial returns. Around the same time, I received an email from Natalie Quinn. She had landed at another consulting firm after leaving Nixora, but had apparently struggled to replicate her early career trajectory. I've been following your success from afar. She wrote, the industry talks about the Prescott method, now client-centered, implementation-focused, relationship-driven. Ironically, these were the very qualities Cameron dismissed when promoting me over you. I was too inexperienced to recognize what I was being handed and what was being taken away. I've spent 3 years trying to build what you create naturally. I'm reaching out to ask if you would consider having coffee and sharing your insights. My first instinct was to ignore the email. After all, this was the woman who had been complicit in my demotion, who had shadowed my meetings and co-opted my work to advance her own career. But as I reread her message, I recognized something I hadn't expected: genuine self-reflection and a desire to learn. We met at a quiet cafe the following week. Natalie seemed smaller somehow, less polished than the confident McKinsey consultant who had sat smugly in my demotion meeting. Thank you for agreeing to meet, she began. I imagine I was the last person you wanted to hear from. I was surprised, I admitted, but not unwilling to listen. She nodded. I owe you an apology. I was brought into Nexora with the explicit mandate to replace you. Cameron told me you were technically competent but lacked strategic vision, and that your relationship-based approach was too slow and inefficient for global scaling. I believed him because he was the CEO, and because it validated my own biases about what constituted strategic leadership. And now, I prompted when she paused. Now I've seen what real strategic leadership looks like. It's not about frameworks and jargon. It's about understanding complex systems and human motivations deeply enough to create solutions that actually work. She looked directly at me. You've built what everyone else is trying to imitate, and you did it by rejecting the very approach I was brought in to implement. Her candor was disarming. The irony, I said, is that I never set out to create some revolutionary approach. I just focused on what actually delivers value to clients. That's precisely what makes it revolutionary, she replied. In an industry obsessed with proprietary methodologies and theoretical models, you prioritized practical outcomes and genuine relationships. It shouldn't be revolutionary, but it is. Our conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Natalie shared her struggles to connect with clients at the level I had. Despite following all the relationship management protocols in her firm's playbook, I explained that genuine connection couldn't be reduced to a playbook. It required authentic curiosity about clients' challenges and a genuine commitment to their success. As we were about to part ways, she asked the question I had been expecting. Is there any possibility of a role at Prescott for someone like me? I understand if that's a bridge too far, but I want to learn what you've built. It was tempting to reject her outright. After all, she had been a willing participant in my professional humiliation. But the woman sitting across from me was not the same ambitious consultant who had happily accepted my position at Nixora. She had been humbled by experience and seemed genuinely interested in a different approach. We don't currently have a role that matches your experience, I said carefully. But I'm willing to consider you for future opportunities if you're serious about adapting to our methodology. She nodded, clearly disappointed, but not surprised. I understand. And thank you for even considering it. Most people in your position wouldn't have agreed to this meeting at all. Most people in my position haven't learned the value of unexpected alliances. I replied with a small smile. Keep in touch. Natalie. The door isn't closed. 6 months later, when we needed additional help with the APSIG expansion, I offered Natalie a 3-month contract position not at the leadership level she might have expected, but as part of an implementation team working directly with clients. To her credit, she accepted without hesitation. I want to learn from the ground up, she said. I've spent too long in theoretical strategy without understanding the implementation challenges. Her humility and willingness to start over impressed me. Over time, Natalie proved to be a valuable addition to our team, bringing analytical rigor while embracing our relationship-focused approach. She eventually became a full-time consultant, and while we never became close friends, we developed a respectful professional relationship built on shared commitment to client outcomes. As Prescott Advisory Partners approached its 5th anniversary, the renewable energy consulting landscape had shifted dramatically. The Prescott method, as some had dubbed our approach, had influenced practices across the industry. Firms that had once prioritized theoretical frameworks and glossy presentations were now emphasizing implementation expertise and relationship continuity. Even Nexora, under new leadership following its acquisition, had attempted to rebrand around principles suspiciously similar to ours. I took it as a compliment rather than an affront. After all, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. The true validation came not from industry recognition, but from client results. The APSIG expansion had created renewable energy infrastructure serving over 20 million people across Asia, with measurable improvements in carbon reduction, economic development, and community sustainability. Similar projects we'd guided in Europe and Africa were showing comparable impacts. We weren't just consulting anymore, we were helping transform energy systems on a global scale. On the exact 5-year anniversary of my demotion meeting, I received a LinkedIn message from Cameron Voss. He was now teaching at a business school, as I'd heard, and had apparently been following my career from afar. Congratulations on your 5-year milestone, he wrote. Prescott Advisory has become a case study I use in my strategic leadership class, specifically on how relationship capital can outweigh traditional strategic assets. I miscalculated badly when I undervalued your approach at Nexora. The company never recovered from the client exodus that followed your departure. If you're ever interested in sharing your perspective with my students, I'd be honored to host you as a guest lecturer. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. The Cameron who had dismissed me as insufficiently strategic was now teaching my approach as a case study in effective leadership. The irony was almost too perfect. Thank you for the invitation, I replied. While I'm not interested in discussing Nexora specifically, I'd be happy to speak with your students about relationship-centered strategic development and the importance of implementation expertise in consulting. Let me know if that would be valuable. His response came quickly. Absolutely. The specific company history is less important than the principles at work. My students would benefit tremendously from hearing directly from you. 2 months later, I found myself standing in front of Cameron's strategic leadership class at the business school. The students, mostly mid-career professionals seeking to advance their trajectories, looked at me with the eager attention of people hoping to discover some secret formula for success. Professor Voss has invited me to speak about relationship-centered strategy in consulting. I began. But before I share specific approaches, I want to challenge a fundamental assumption that pervades much of business education and practice the idea that strategy and relationships are separate domains, with the former being more valuable and prestigious than the latter. I noticed Cameron shift slightly in his seat at the back of the room. In reality, the most effective business strategies are deeply relational. They're built on profound understanding of human motivations, organizational dynamics, and trust-based networks. They succeed not despite focusing on relationships, but because of it. For the next hour, I shared case studies from our work at Prescott Advisory Partners, carefully anonymized to protect client confidentiality. I explained how deep relational understanding had enabled us to develop implementation strategies that addressed not just technical and financial requirements, but also cultural, political, and human factors that typically derail large-scale projects. During the Q&A session, a student raised her hand. Professor Voss mentioned that your firm grew out of a pivotal career moment when you were essentially demoted despite bringing in significant business. How did you navigate that transition without burning bridges that might be valuable later? I glanced at Cameron, who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. That's an excellent question about a common scenario, I replied carefully. Many professionals face moments when their contributions are undervalued or when organizational politics override performance metrics. How you respond to those moments defines not just your next career step, but your professional identity. I paused, considering how much to reveal. In my case, I recognized that the disconnect wasn't just about my individual role, but about fundamentally different philosophies of value creation. Rather than fighting to be valued within a system that fundamentally misunderstood my approach, I chose to create an alternative system where that approach could flourish. But weren't you angry? The student pressed. Didn't you want to prove them wrong? I smiled. Of course there was disappointment, but converting that into revenge would have been a strategic error. Success isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right. I focused on creating something valuable rather than dismantling what wasn't serving me. The clients who chose to follow didn't do so because I poisoned their perception of my former employer, but because I offered something they genuinely needed. After the class, Cameron approached me as students filtered out. That was masterfully done, he said. You conveyed the essence without making me look like the villain I probably was. There are no villains in business decisions, I replied. Just different priorities and perspectives. You valued credentials and theoretical frameworks. I valued relationships and implementation expertise. The market ultimately decided which approach delivered more value. He nodded slowly. The board forced me out 3 months after you left. They said I had catastrophically misread our core value proposition by letting you go. I've spent 5 years teaching business strategy while trying to understand where I went wrong. And have you figured it out? I asked, genuinely curious. I think so, he said. I confused pedigree with competence, and theoretical knowledge with practical wisdom. I wanted McKinsey's prestige without recognizing that what our clients valued wasn't prestigious methodologies, but tangible results. His self-awareness surprised me. That's a valuable insight to share with your students. I do, he said. Your story without naming you, of course, has become central to my teaching on strategic leadership. I tell them that the greatest strategic mistake I ever made was failing to recognize that relationships aren't soft skills. They're the hardest skills to master and the most valuable assets in business. As I left the business school that day, I reflected on how far we'd all come from that Friday afternoon ambush meeting. Cameron had lost his CEO position, but gained valuable perspective he now shared with future business leaders. Natalie had humbled herself to learn a different approach and was now thriving as a senior consultant at Prescott. And I had built something far more valuable and impactful than would have been possible had I remained at Nixora. Even with the promotion I'd once coveted. The narrative could easily be framed as revenge. They demoted me after I closed a $480 million deal. So I took the clients with me and built a more successful company. But that framing misses the deeper truth. What happened wasn't about revenge, but about recognition. Recognizing my own value when others failed to. And recognizing that true success comes not from proving others wrong, but from creating genuine value in the marketplace. Today, 7 years after that pivotal moment, Prescott Advisory Partners employs over 100 consultants across 4 continents. We've helped implement renewable energy projects serving more than 50 million people worldwide. Our client retention rate stands at 97%. Unheard of in an industry where relationships typically last only a few years at most. When young consultants ask me for career advice, I don't tell them to wait for recognition or to plot revenge when it doesn't come. Instead, I share the philosophy that has guided my own journey. Your value isn't determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. When you consistently create genuine value and build authentic relationships, you carry that with you wherever you go. The rest is just details. They demoted me after I closed a $480 million deal, so I took the clients with me. Not out of revenge, but out of respect for the trust those clients had placed in me and the value I knew I could continue to deliver. In doing so, I didn't just save my career, I transformed it into something far more meaningful than I had ever imagined possible. And that's a strategic outcome even Cameron would have to admire.